Today I'm excited to share with you a powerful winning line for white. I'm confident this strategy will help you score plenty of victories, so let's dive right in and get started. This opening variation begins after the first move pawn to e4, followed by pawn to e5. Then we enter one of my favorite openings, the bishop's opening, with bishop to c4. If black responds with one of the natural developing moves, such as knight to c6 or bishop to c5, let's consider the line with bishop to c5, where black simply mirrors white's move. Alright, so we've played knight to c3. Now, if black keeps copying and plays knight to c6, we reach a position where white can launch a really devastating attack. Just for reference, if black had instead developed their knight to f6, that would lead us into a totally different opening, like the four knights game. But for this video, we're focusing on the line with knight to c6, which is a very typical move for black in this setup. Now, instead of playing a natural developing move like bringing our other knight to f3 or playing a quiet pawn to d3, white suddenly strikes with queen to g4. This move is the start of an immediate attack. The idea behind it is simple but powerful. We are directly threatening to capture the pawn on g7. If black doesn't respond correctly, we take that pawn, which causes serious problems. Not only does it threaten the rook in the corner, but it also creates instant pressure on black's entire position, tying their pieces up and setting up for even bigger threats later on. So, queen to g4 is a direct and dangerous threat. Black has several possible defenses, but each of them comes with significant drawbacks. For example, if black plays king to f8, that does indeed defend the pawn on g7. However, the major drawback is that the king loses the right to castle, and very soon I'll show you how white can launch a strong attack in this case. Clearly, this is not an ideal solution for black. Now, another common defensive idea for black is to play pawn to g6. Once again, this move successfully prevents our queen from capturing on g7, but it comes at a huge cost. It creates serious weaknesses on the dark squares around the king, especially on f6 and h6. If black decides to castle kingside, they'll be sheltering their king in a house full of holes. That also leaves black in a very uncomfortable, shaky position, and I'll demonstrate exactly how we break through that setup shortly. However, the move you will see most often from your opponents is queen to f6. This looks very tempting for black. It seems like a great move because it does two things at once. It defends the pawn on g7, and it also counterattacks by threatening to play queen takes f2, which would be check. On the surface, this looks like a strong and logical move, which is exactly why most players instinctively go for it. But here's the good news. This natural-looking move is actually a losing mistake. Instead of getting scared and trying to passively defend the pawn on f2, we double down on our attack with the surprising and powerful move knight to d5. At first glance, this looks crazy. It seems like we're walking right into their threat. But here's the hidden idea. If black goes ahead and plays queen takes f2 check, we simply move our king to d1. Suddenly, the tables are completely turned. Their queen is now dangerously exposed in the middle of the board, and we have a devastating attack brewing. At first glance, it might seem like black is doing really well. After all, the queen just captured a pawn and is sitting dangerously close to white's king. It looks scary for white, and many players will feel confident here. But let's take a closer look at the position. The truth is, the black queen has no real follow-up. Every square the queen could potentially use is already covered and controlled by white's pieces. That means the so-called attack is just a single check with no actual danger behind it. Meanwhile, our threats as white are very real and incredibly dangerous. We are still threatening to play queen takes g7, which would absolutely devastate black's kingside. We are also threatening knight takes c7, forking the king and the rook. A very powerful tactical idea that wins material on the spot. And if that weren't enough, there's a hidden third trap in this position that most opponents completely overlook, which makes our attack even more potent. Now, let's think about how black might try to respond. Under this kind of pressure, most players will panic and choose a weak defensive move. One of the most common mistakes is knight to f6, but this move completely misses the point. It doesn't actually do anything to stop our main threat of queen takes g7, and very soon, black will find themselves in deep, deep trouble. In fact, the move knight to f6 only makes white's attack stronger. Now, not only are we threatening to capture the rook on h8 with check, but we are also directly attacking the knight that just moved to f6. This sequence is completely losing for black, yet surprisingly many players still fall right into this trap. Another very common mistake is the move pawn to d6. On the surface, this looks logical. Black is trying to create an escape route for their queen and hopes that we might somehow overlook their threat on f2. But in reality, this move is just as bad because it once again does nothing to stop our major threat of queen takes g7. We simply ignore their plan and execute the capture, and the game is practically over right there. Whether you follow up by taking on g7 or playing the fork on c7, you will have complete control and an overwhelming winning attack. We'll take a closer look at these specific lines in a moment, but the important point is this. After these common mistakes, black is almost always lost within just a few moves. Now what if black tries to be stubborn and finds the best defensive idea? That would be king to f8, which directly defends the pawn on g7. Even here, white has a powerful and hidden resource. You respond with the unexpected move, knight to h3. This is a really subtle idea. Suddenly the situation changes completely. The black queen on f2, which was supposed to be their main attacker, actually becomes the target of our attack. At this point, the black queen is almost completely trapped. Notice that your knight is directly attacking it, and every potential escape square is already covered by white's pieces. The only retreat left for the queen is queen to d4. But even there, the queen is not safe. White calmly defends it with the bishop, leaving the queen with no real way out. On the very next move, you can simply push pawn to c3, and the black queen will be captured. It's extremely difficult for black to find any resource to save the queen. There's really no escape. To illustrate this, let's look at a real game example. In that game, black tried bishop to b6, attempting to create an escape path for the queen so that it wouldn't be trapped after pawn to c3. Although it gives the queen a square, the position is still very ugly and full of problems. Instead of rushing, white continued with rook to f1, a very typical move in this variation. This achieves two things. First, it brings another piece into the attack, and second, it lines up perfectly against the weak pawn on f7. That pawn is now under tremendous pressure, and checkmate threats against the black king can arise in just a couple of moves. Black already has plenty to worry about, but the position becomes even more dangerous once white brings the rook into play. Not only does it join the attack against the vulnerable f7 pawn, but it also cuts off key retreat squares for the black queen, leaving it with fewer and fewer options. Even if white's knight later jumps into the attack, the queen still has no safe escape route and remains under constant threat of being captured in the center of the board. In the actual game, black tried to hold the position with a pawn push, but that only opened the door for white's pieces to crash through. The knight sacrificed itself on f6, tearing apart black's pawn structure, and after the exchange, white's bishop to f6 and rook swept in with overwhelming force. Suddenly, the black king was under fire from every direction. From there, the attack played itself. White's rook delivered checks, the queen to g7 invaded along the kingside, and black had no way to defend. Whether the rook tried to retreat, the king attempted to run, or pieces tried to block, everything was already covered. Within just a few moves, white converted the attack into a decisive checkmate. What makes this so striking is how quickly the position collapsed. From what looked like a harmless queen move at the start, white unleashed a brutal attack that Stockfish itself confirms as completely sound. Not just a cheap trick, but a powerful and reliable weapon.